everybody. Today we are going to be talking about topic 3, day 6, which is solving quadratic equations by taking square roots. So in your earlier math classes, you may have seen problems like 3x squared equals 27. And so you were asked to solve for x, and the idea was to get it to a point where you could take the square root of both sides if you only have one thing that is squared. So the first thing that you had to do was you had to isolate the squared term. So I see that x squared is what the squared term is. So I'm going to divide both sides by 3 because I want to get the x squared isolated. I want to isolate that. And if x squared is being multiplied by 3, then to isolate x squared, I would divide both sides by 3. So 3 divided by 3 is 1. I'm left with x squared equals 9. Then, once you have isolated the squared term, then you can take the square root of both sides. So I'm taking the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is x. And the square root of 9 is 3, but I'm trying to figure out what number squared would be positive 9. Positive 3 times positive 3 is 9, or negative 3 times 3 is 9. So I would say this out loud: x equals plus or minus 3, meaning that x equals positive 3, or x could also be negative 3. So the last step would be with an asterisk, that would say don't forget the plus or minus symbol. And you'll use that plus or minus symbol anytime you're solving for x and you have to take a square root and there's an equation that you're trying to solve. So the problems in this section are a little more complex than this. So let's go into the section. So as you can see, this problem is a little more complex, but the ideas are still the same. So the first thing we want to do, remember, is we want to isolate the squared term. And so do I have a highlighter? Let's see. Yes. Okay, so my squared term is this x minus 7 squared. So if I want to isolate it, then that means I need to add 48 to both sides. So plus 48 over there, plus 48 over there. Then I'll do my work here. I'll have 4 times x minus 7 squared equals, and 12 plus 48 is 60. Then, have I isolated my squared term? And just a reminder, the squared term is this parentheses that is squared. No, I have not. I'm going to divide both sides by 4. So divide this side by 4, divide this side by 4. So now I have the quantity x minus 7 squared equals 15. Okay, next step is going to be to take the square root of both sides. And when you take the square root of both sides, don't forget about that plus or minus symbol. So I'm going to take the square root of the left side. I'll take the square root of the right side. When you take the square root of a quantity squared, all it does is it cancels out the squared. Because if you square root something that's squared, it's like you're undoing the work that happened in the first place. So when you square root something squared, the squared exponent just goes away. So x minus 7 equals, and the square root of 15 is not a perfect square, so I'm going to leave it as the square root of 15. And then I'm going to leave that plus or minus. Don't forget the plus or minus. Now, I haven't finished solving for this yet. So step 3 is going to be to solve. And when you solve, you have the x all by itself. So I need to add the 7 to both sides. So x equals, now I can't add 7 to the square root of 15 because they're not like radicals. They don't, the 15's inside a radical, the 7's outside, so I'm going to leave it as 7 plus or minus the square root of 15. And this is actually two answers. One answer is 7 plus the square root of 15, and the other answer is 7 minus the square root of 15. Now, if you wanted to see what that was as a decimal, I could do 7 plus square root of 15 in my calculator and see that that is about 10.873, but they want me to write the answer in simplest form, which means they're looking for this. But I'm also noticing they let me have this plus or minus symbol, so I bet Delta Math wants me to enter my answer like this. So I will enter 7 plus or minus the square root of 15. Check my answer. Correct. Next problem is the same. So let's try it. I'm going to add the 37 to both sides. So I'll have 5 times x minus 8 squared equals 10, because negative 27 plus 37 is 10. Then I can divide both sides by 5 because I still want to isolate that squared term. So I have x minus 8 quantity squared equals 2. Then I can take the square root of both sides. The square root cancels out the square. And I have x minus 8 equals plus or minus the square root of 2. I can add 8 to both sides, but remember we don't add it in the radical, we keep it separate. X equals 8 plus or minus the square root of 2. You could also write x equals the square root of plus or minus square root of 2 plus 8. That's also acceptable, but you won't see people writing this as often because sometimes we get a little sloppy when we write our radicals, and so sometimes it's a little unclear if people mean that radical to extend over the plus 8 or not. So to prevent that confusion from happening, you usually see people write that 8 in front, in case you're wondering. So I'll type in 8 plus or minus the square root of 2, submit my answer. There we go. Now, if we go back, you'll also notice there's a level 2. So let's look at the problems in here. They look similar. So let's see what happens. I'm going to add the 14 to both sides, or 45 to both sides. I'll have 4 times 2x minus 8 quantity squared equals negative 21 plus 45 is 24. Then I can divide both sides by 4. So I'll have 2x minus 8 quantity squared equals 24 divided by 4 is 6. So these are looking very similar to what we did before. I can take the square root of both sides. The square root of something squared cancels. So we have 2x minus 8 equals plus or minus the square root of 6. And now here's where it's a little different because what's inside the radical, we have to solve a little more. But I'll still solve by adding the 8. So now we have 2x equals 8 plus or minus the square root of 6. And now I still don't have the x by itself. I need to divide it. Divide both sides by 2. And we'll have x equals 8 plus or minus the square root of 6 divided by 2. And we'll enter our answer just like that. You can use the division key on your keyboard to create a fraction. 8 plus or minus the square root of 6 over 2. Submit your answer. And it's correct.